Hi, I'm here today with my father, Brendan Loughlin, and it is January 8th, and we are going to be talking about the amazing story of Joseph in the Old Testament, which begins in Genesis chapter 37. And this is a favorite of my father's, and I grew to love it through him, through his telling me the story of how Joseph's life would go. And I'm going to let him start off because this is one of his favorites and it's one of my favorites also. So, Dad, give us some facts about Joseph and the story that we'll be telling over the next few videos.
Okay, so this would be today an introduction to what we will be doing over the next several weeks. Um, the story of Joseph is considered by all the Bible experts to be the most beautiful representation, picture of the life of Jesus and what he would do and how he would be persecuted by his brethren and how he would be, in a sense, put to death when they had murder in their heart, how he would be restored by the Father, blessed by the Father, and that eventually all knees would bow to Jesus, including all his brothers. And so Joseph would have these dreams. And we want to today talk about the different aspects of the story of Joseph, how he began as a 17-year-old shepherd and how he was favored by his father. And then we're going to take you through the process. But these stories are so detailed, we have to do them one at a time. So today we're just giving thoughts about Joseph. And he was 30 years old that time when he was lifted up, when he was in prison, and Pharaoh lifted him up to be king of Egypt. And Jesus was 30 years old, and he would actually save the world at that point in time through the knowledge that the Father had given him. And so this is just so important about what is happening now. That was a picture of what is happening now. And God will not destroy this earth. God will let people come to their wits' end. But as in the story of Joseph, his words were, I will nourish you. When they thought it was all over, I will nourish you. And the father, who would be represented by Pharaoh in this story, said to Joseph, let's put them in the best part of the land, Goshen. So right now, it does seem like Joseph's brothers at the time, when things were going very badly during the famine, like all is lost. But instead, a feast is coming, and that is our purpose today. So, all right, so Christine loves the part, lots of the parts. She loves the whole story like I do. And I think today, if we want to bring out certain parts, and then we're going to do we're going to take a section of the scriptures, and future videos we'll say, all right, we are now talking from Genesis 37 to 14 and so forth, and then go all the way through. The book of Genesis will end with the death of Joseph, and Jacob would die, and the blessings would go upon Israel, and a brand new thing would start. That's how it would end. And then it would then go on to Moses in the book of Exodus. So, Chris, I'll let you give some thoughts.
Yeah, I love the story of Joseph, and Joseph is a perfect type of Jesus. And you got to think about, who was Joseph? He was the 11th child of 12 of Jacob's sons. And he was actually, his mother was Rachel. And the other brothers, Rachel would have Joseph and then Benjamin with Jacob. Joseph's other wife, Leah, and 2 concubines would have the other 10 sons. Joseph was highly favored by his father, and he was the most beloved of his father, as is Jesus is the most beloved of his father. Joseph was also firstborn to Rachel. Jesus is God the Father's firstborn. So we see the similarities here. Joseph was probably the most righteous man in the Old Testament. And, you know, throughout the Old Testament there were others, but Joseph would absolutely represent the Lord Jesus. Jacob was also called by his father, God, the Lord Jehovah, Israel. And now why is that, Dad? Why did God rename Jacob Israel?
Well, he named him Israel when he wrestled with the angel at that point in time. And so that's when Jacob's thigh was bruised by the angel. But God at that point decided to name Jacob Israel, which would, so Israel would become all of the sons of Jacob. Israel, they would be called the tribes of Israel at the death of Jacob. So when Jacob would die at that point in time, he'd be 147 years old. He called them all in and he blessed them. And then right after that, they became the nation of Israel. So he was named by God after he defeated the angel, and he wrestled all night. But
So that really happened, because a lot of people read these things and they don't know if these things really happened. But that really happened. He
yeah,
really wrestled an angel.
he really did. Yeah, he did, and he won. If you I can't imagine what it's like to wrestle with an angel.
That is,
And,
that is
yeah,
really hard to imagine.
Yeah, there's a famous painting by Paul Gauguin, probably one of his best paintings, Jacob wrestling with the angel.
Wow.
And beautiful painting. But
It
yes,
shows,
it happened.
It shows his endurance and the endurance that Israel would have to go through, perhaps throughout history.
They would take a great wound, the wound that Jacob would have in his thigh would carry him right through. He'd have it right to the end of his life.
Yes.
But at the end of Jacob's life, imagine he would be restored to Joseph at that point in time. When Jacob finally got to see his son again, he was 130 years old. So he had not seen his son for many years at that point. Joseph at that point would have been 37.
Wow.
So it was a long period of time that had gone by.
20 years.
No, wait, Joseph would have been 39 because the famine was 7 years.
Okay.
So he was 30th, so then 2 more. So he was 39.
So it was 22 years.
Yeah, it was a long time. Or less. It would have been less because it would have been the opposite way, wouldn't it? Well, we'll do the math another time. But it was many, many years.
So from 17.
From 17 until he was 39, he had not seen his father.
I believe that's 22 years, if my math is right. But that's a miracle. So here Joseph is at 17, and they called him his brothers called him the dreamer.
The dreamer.
And they actually use the scriptures use the word hated. They hated on him.
They did.
Because of his dreams. And
Yep.
so his first dream was, the word in the Bible is used as sheaves, which I believe are stacks of hay that are tied. Is that?
Yeah, that's so they would have been in the field,
right,
with either the wheat or the corn stalk, and they were tying them together, and then Joseph's his sheep would stand up
in the dream, and the others would bow down,
and while the others it would rise, and the dream, Joseph would look, and then all the sheep of the others would also stand up, and they would bow down to his sheep. And that infuriated the brothers. He
told the dream at 17 to his older brothers, yes, that they would be basically bowing down to him in his dream. And it says they hated on him.
They hated him more. That's a good point. So the whole thing with the dreams, in the beginning, it says they already hated him because he was loved of the Father more. They were the sons of Bilhah, so the concubines would be Bilhah and Zilpath. And so Joseph, it starts off, he was a shepherd working with the brothers of the concubines, and they were doing something wrong, and he went to Jacob, his father,
Mm-hmm.
and said he gave an evil report. They were
Oh, that's
they were
right.
making a mistake, but they had already hated him right from the beginning, because Jacob, from the time he was born, blessed him and
Well, he
loved
would
him.
stitch that beautiful multicolored famous coat that
Yeah,
we all know about and read about in the Bible, that Jacob stitched uh, an entire coat, multicolored, beautiful coat, and gave it to one son, his most beloved son, who would be Joseph.
hmm
And the other brothers must have just been so envious and saw the love that the father had for this one son. And, Rachel was probably the love of his life. It seems like she was. I think we agree that she probably
yes,
was.
yes,
Her sister Leah was also Jacob's wife.
yes.
And at that point, were both women dead, or?
Yeah, sure. At this point, Rachel had died
Hmm.
giving birth at
To
that time.
Benjamin, the younger
Right. So,
brother.
so Jacob at this point would have been a widower, and he would have been a widower at this point, mourning the loss of Rachel.
And so he really bonded with Joseph, probably even more after losing his wife. The other brothers were older, probably more independent, although they were a close family. And he sent them to another land to do some work. Do you know the name of that city they went?
He went to Shechem.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So what happened is Jacob was aware that the other sons were going to Shechem, which is quite a distance. And so the brothers went to Shechem, and Jacob would be worried about them. When they got to Shechem, they decided that they needed more greener grass, so they went about 15 miles north to Dothan.
Dothan.
So they were further away. So at that point, Jacob said to Joseph, I need a report about my sons and see that they do well. So he sent Joseph. Joseph said, here I am, I'll go.
Mm.
And
Wearing his coat.
yeah, and wearing the coat, and can you imagine what that would have been like? This beautiful coat. No one had a coat like that in those days.
Right.
And now he's going by himself at 17, and he's going quite a distance, and he made it to Shechem, and it says he was wandering around looking for his brothers in a field, and another shepherd saw him and said, what are you looking for? And he said, the brothers of my father Jacob. And he said, oh, I heard them say they were going to Dothan.
Mm-hmm.
So Dothan is now another 15 miles, but Joseph was determined. So the text is really interesting. It said how they saw him coming from quite a distance because it was a field. And in their heart, they're like,
the dreamer cometh.
Here cometh the dreamer, let's kill him.
Mm.
And when I was reading that, I was thinking about what a contrast with the parable son, the prodigal.
Right.
And so when he returns to his father, the father, same thing, sees him from a distance and runs after him with a desire to kiss him on the neck.
Yep.
And here Joseph's own brothers are not going to run to kiss him, run towards him. They're like, let's plan to kill him.
Right.
So
they had murder in their heart.
They had murder in their
at
heart.
That point.
And God only has love. Jesus would point out to us that his Father only has love in his heart for the world. That's why the famous scripture that you love, and you point out, God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever would not perish, but have everlasting life.
Yes.
So anyway, they were, at the beginning of the story, they were way off. They were consumed with anger. They could not take it that their brother, who had been favored, had this beautiful coat on. And you love that story, so I'll let you take it from the coat part.
Oh, yeah, well, the brothers, yes, absolutely, they saw Joseph from a distance. Now, Joseph has the opposite reaction. He has good tidings and love and greetings from his father, bringing to his brothers that he loves.
Yeah.
And they have the opposite. They have, here cometh the dreamer. And they, one of the dreams that Joseph has before he left, and he told his father and he told his brothers, was that the sun and the moon and was it 11 stars
Yeah.
were basically being obedient to him. Excuse me. And even Jacob, even his father said, Joseph, are you insinuating that I and your mother should come and bow down before you?
Yeah.
So, but Joseph was so enthusiastic. These dreams were coming from God, I believe. And he was a dreamer, and they saw him, and they had this evil, they wanted to do away with him. So he ended up coming to them, and they would, I guess that it doesn't really say, but they somehow grabbed him and threw him into a pit without water.
They tore his coat off.
First took his coat.
Yeah, and can you imagine tearing his coat off? And at that point in time, they discussed, there was some arguments between them, like what should we do, whether it be murder, and then it was, I think it was Reuben who said,
It was Reuben.
Yeah, put him into the well.
Yeah.
And rather than have his blood on his hands.
Right.
And so
let us not have our brother's blood on our hands.
Yeah. So although I don't know what their plan was at that point, they still would have been murdered him if they left him in the well.
Yeah.
But that's how God times things. So you see the caravan coming of the Midianites, and of course the Midianites were they used to sell anything they could get their hands on.
Right.
Spices and anything. They would go into the markets, and
so their camels with all kinds of goods were coming, and they were headed.
A camel train with the goods, and they're like, "Wow, we have an opportunity now
to sell him."
And then it's out of the way. But they had the coat; they had torn the coat off of him, and so they did that. And you know what I was reading this morning about when they were locked in, when they had, this is much later, when Joseph would accuse them of being spies, and they thought he was the king of Egypt and had power, put them in prison. Now they were all in the prison, and they bought the same thing, the same event came back into their mind, and they said, did we not remember the fear that our brother had? Did we not see his eyes? They're like, and now here we are, and this is God, this is the will of God, that God is doing this to us. We are now experiencing, and they did. They didn't know, like Joseph just threw them in prison. And
yeah, so that was much, much later.
No, that was years later.
Yeah.
This is how God reverses things. And think about Jesus, the same thing, about, did we not, I mean, how many, at the time in Israel, many people loved Jesus in Israel.
Yes.
But the leaders did not. And they're like going to be, did we not see the fear? Imagine what they saw. They saw him being crucified. They were the ones, the leaders who did that. And so and then it says in Zechariah, they will mourn for what they did. Well, here we have the same thing happening in this story of Joseph. How when he comes and they do this to him, and they get the blood of a goat and put it on the coat.
That's
same
terrible.
coat,
yeah.
To show the Father he's dead. I mean, this was sin. Sin begets sin.
Yeah.
So it started with hatred, murder in the heart. Then just keep making this lying. Let's make the sin worse.
Let's point out that he was sold for 20 pieces of silver. He was a minor. He was under 18. I recently heard that 20 pieces of silver back then for a minor is equal to 30 pieces of silver for an adult.
Yes.
So here we have the exact type of Joseph being sold out by his own for 20 pieces of silver. Jesus being sold out by his own for 30 pieces of silver. It's God showed right there, what was going to happen to even the name Joseph. It sounds similar to Jesus, right?
It does.
God uses
beautiful name.
Yeah, it's so beautiful. And what they did with that coat after they sold Joseph for 20 pieces of silver to the Midianites, who were heading to Egypt. they took the coat, they killed a kid goat, a small goat, and they dipped the coat in the blood that they
Yeah.
would bring back to Jacob, who would be heartbroken and would think that his son Joseph was killed by a vicious animal, and would mourn and mourn and mourn. It said in the text he mourned many days. No one could comfort him. His sons couldn't comfort him. His daughter Dinah,
Yeah.
she couldn't comfort him. The people that knew him couldn't comfort him. So this was and Joseph was still alive, but of course Jacob would think for many years that his son had perished, and at this point Joseph is on his way to Egypt, and that's where how do you say it?
So Potiphar,
Potiphar,
who would be the captain of the guard for Pharaoh. Now, Potiphar was one of the top people in Egypt. This was a great man, and he had an estate. He had a house with multiple servants, and he saw, like when he saw Joseph, the beauty of the man, the character of the man, the intelligence of the man, just like Jesus, must have been written all over his face. Potiphar would buy Joseph as a slave, but put him in, bring him into the house, and right away the house started to prosper and be blessed.
God was with Joseph.
God was with him, and it says Potiphar saw that. So here's this Egyptian captain of the guard recognizing this man is special, and everything, he was brilliant. Everything he did
prospered.
It prospered. And the interesting thing about Potiphar is, as the story goes on in that case, he gives Joseph the checkbook, in effect. Is really interesting. It actually says all Potiphar worried about was eating his food. Everything else he turned over to Joseph. He would sit and eat, and okay, Joseph, it's all yours. You're in charge of the whole estate.
So he gave him power and authority.
Total, just like Pharaoh would do later.
Give
and
him
just like the same thing that would happen with the keeper of the prison would do the same, and then Pharaoh would do. So you had three. You had first Potiphar, and Joseph would prosper that house.
Yeah, and let's talk about that, because that house was blessed. It says in the Bible that they were all blessed. Everybody in that house were blessed abundantly because God was with who? Joseph.
Right.
But we can go on to talk about what would happen with Potiphar's wife, who saw Joseph as a very attractive young man that she wanted to lie with.
Yeah, there's a lot going on there. You have to kind of follow. It's just what Christine said. But the more you look into it, there's even more going on. Because if you slowly read the text and you see Joseph is in the house, and Potiphar slowly is turning everything over to him. And then it finally says, and then he gave him run of the entire, everything. He ran it all. He had total power. Joseph did. And then Potiphar would go off and do his job, come back and eat, and that's all he knew. So all of a sudden, Joseph now has charge of the estate and the checkbook. Then it says, after this, so this wife would have seen and known Joseph before that, but once he got in power, now, so you begin to wonder, was she conspiring with the person who was before Joseph, who was running it? It wasn't the Potiphar, because he just wanted to be the captain of the guard. Potiphar must have felt there was a lot of things going wrong in the house that weren't prospering. Someone was stealing something. So now the wife, who turned out to be an evil woman, probably had some kind of connection with whatever was happening before, and said, this man has the checkbook. So I think it was part of that. This is a thought of mine, just an opinion, that I think, because the way it says, after he became head, now he became more attractive. So that's something we should at least consider. Yeah, so sure, she would set him up. She
did have eyes for him, though.
Oh, she did, but I still think
there was more to it.
There was more to it. I think a lot of it had to do, when you look at all, like Jezebel, and you look at Herod's wife, there's more to it.
Inspiring.
There's all power. There's all stuff going on all the time.
Right.
But anyway, it's all selfishness and evil. But either way, she would set him up, and she tried to get him many times to lie with me, and he would say, "How can I do this? How can I do this to my man? He has set me up, and he has given me all these blessings, and how can I do this? I cannot do this." So Joseph at that point says, stayed away from her, avoided her. But
He called it a great sin against his master
Yeah.
and against his God.
he did.
So, Joseph was so righteous that he would never do that and sin against God that way, or sin against, this is how righteous this man is. I mean, she was probably very beautiful. She
Had to
was
be.
married to Potiphar. She was probably very, very beautiful. And, Joseph really stood by his morals, his love of God, his love of his master, Potiphar, who treated him so well. But she would, one day when he went into the house, they were alone, and she would grab him by the coat, or the robe, I think it said, and pull it. And
It says garment, so it could have been a robe. We don't know. It's part of his clothing.
and he would flee, and she would be left holding the garment alone in the house.
The smoking gun in her mind.
Yeah.
It's like, okay.
And she immediately started to scream to the other men that worked there that this Hebrew, I think she called him, they bring in this young Hebrew youth, and look what he has done. And so she basically accused him of trying to lay with her against her will, and brought that before her husband. Everyone knew at that point. Everybody must have known. And Potiphar was in a
Rage.
situation. Yeah, and he
was in a rage when he found out.
Sure, I mean.
But it doesn't say what the rage. It says in Potiphar was filled with wrath, but it doesn't say why. In other words, I think Potiphar maybe had a good sense, because right before that he said he knew that God was with him. So he comes back and his wife says, "Look, I have this garment." But Potiphar was in a difficult position.
Sure.
And
we think about Herod when he was set up by his wife and the stepdaughter, and the dance, and then give me the head of John the Baptist.
Yeah.
He did not want to do that. It was his birthday. But, it's a similar situation of someone being set up, and that could have been the situation. We don't know for sure. But Potiphar would send Joseph at that point to prison. But was it a king's prison?
It was the king's ward, that's right. So it was only for the prisoners that were related to the palace situation. So they were all high-end prisoners. But
so they weren't these dangerous, crazy.
No, they would be white-collar. We'll call them.
Yeah, white-collar prisoners.
White-collar prisoners. But the point. Another thing before we finish on Potiphar and his wife. All these situations when Joseph would be lifted up, the message really comes forward, which Joseph himself would later say to his brothers. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. So, this would even apply to Potiphar's wife. I mean, the same thing he would later say to his brothers, that you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good.
How amazing is our God?
It applies even, think about that.
Yeah.
So Potiphar's wife, like Joseph never would have wound up in prison, which would lead to become the king of Egypt. And
exactly.
Right, so